Denis Healey signed the cancellation on April 6, 1965, and within weeks the physical evidence of Britain's most advanced strike aircraft was being cut apart with oxyacetylene torches at Brooklands and Weybridge. The order that came down from the Ministry of Aviation was specific and unambiguous. Destroy the airframes, destroy the jigs, destroy the tooling. Sir George Edwards, chairman of the British Aircraft Corporation, would later describe the instruction as the most bitter moment of his professional life. His engineers had spent 7 years and roughly £195 million of public money building an aircraft that flew twice the speed of sound at treetop height, and now they were being told to reduce it to scrap so thoroughly that no future government could resurrect it. The TSR-2, Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance, Mark II, was meant to replace the aging Canberra in RAF service and give Britain an independent low-level nuclear delivery system that could operate from short, damaged runways in West Germany. The specification, General Operational Requirement 339, had been issued in 1957 by the Air Staff under Air Chief Marshal Sir Dermot Boyle. It demanded a combat radius of 1,000 nautical miles, terrain following radar, a payload of 6 1,000-pound bombs or a single Redbeard tactical nuclear weapon, and the ability to take off from 3,000 feet of rough strip. No aircraft in the world could yet do those things. British industry proposed to build one anyway. The prototype XR-219 made its first flight from Boscombe Down on September 27, 1964, with Roland Beaumont at the controls. Beaumont, who had flown Tempests over Germany in 1945 and later commanded the Canberra Development Programme at Wharton, was one of the most experienced test pilots in the country. He took XR-219 airborne for 14 minutes and reported that the aircraft, despite an undercarriage that had refused to retract and vibration problems in the Bristol Siddeley Olympus 320 engines, handled well. Over the following months he pushed it through the sound barrier and demonstrated the terrain following system at 200 feet above Salisbury Plain. The RAF's project pilot, Wing Commander Jimmy Dell, flew it faster still. 24 test flights were completed. Then the Wilson government came to power in October 1964 with a manifesto commitment to review defence expenditure, and the TSR-2 became the most conspicuous target in the Ministry of Defence budget. Healey, appointed Secretary of State for Defence, inherited a project whose unit cost had risen from an estimated £2.1 million per aircraft to something closer to £5 million, whose in-service date had slipped from 1965 to 1969, and whose political constituency inside Whitehall had been steadily eroded by Treasury officials who regarded the whole enterprise as ruinous. Lord Zuckerman, chief scientific advisor to the Cabinet, had been briefing against the aircraft privately for months. The decision was taken at Cabinet on April 1, 1965. Healey announced it in the budget speech on the 6th, coupling the cancellation with an option to purchase the American General Dynamics F111 as a replacement. The Commons erupted. Aubrey Jones, the former Conservative Minister of Supply, called it a national humiliation. Sir George Edwards heard the news by telephone at Weybridge and rang his design director, Bill Cotton, without speaking for several seconds. What followed was not a wind-down, but a demolition. The Treasury insisted that every jig, every fixture, and every partially completed airframe be broken up so that the programme could never be reinstated by a future administration seeking to embarrass the current one. The men who had built the aircraft were ordered to destroy it themselves. The origins of that destruction lay 8 years earlier, in a document that had already killed off much of the British aircraft industry. Duncan Sandys, appointed Minister of Defence by Harold Macmillan in January 1957, presented his Defence White Paper to Parliament on April 4th that year. Command 124 argued that manned military aircraft were approaching obsolescence and that ballistic missiles would dominate future warfare. The paper cancelled 7 fighter projects at a stroke and stated explicitly that the English Electric Lightning, then still in development, would probably be the last manned interceptor the Royal Air Force ever operated. Sandys was 50 and had commanded an anti-aircraft rocket regiment during the war. He believed with the certainty of a convert that guided weapons had rendered pilots redundant. The air staff disagreed. Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Dermot Boyle, then Chief of the Air Staff, argued forcefully within Whitehall that a low-level strike aircraft was still needed to deliver tactical nuclear weapons against Warsaw Pact airfields and armoured formations. The Soviet SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile, which had entered service in 1957, made high-altitude penetration of the V-bomber type increasingly hazardous. Boyle's successor from 1960, Air Chief Marshal Sir Thomas Pike, continued the argument. GOR 339 was the air staff's answer, an aircraft that would fly beneath radar coverage at 200 feet, and Mach 0.9, popping up only to release its weapon. Sandys accepted the requirement reluctantly, on condition that the industry rationalized itself into a smaller number of firms capable of managing a project of this scale. That condition produced the British Aircraft Corporation, formed on July 1, 1960 through the forced merger of Vickers Armstrongs, English Electric Aviation, and Bristol Aeroplane. Hunting Aircraft joined shortly afterwards. Sir George Edwards, who had designed the Viscount airliner and the Valiant bomber, became executive director. The rival contender, a joint proposal from Handley Page and Avro, was rejected. The TSR-2 was to be built at Weybridge, Wharton and Samlesbury simultaneously, with final assembly at Weybridge. This dispersal was politically necessary. It kept employment in 3 constituencies, but it created coordination problems that added months to the schedule and pounds to every component. The engine choice was equally political. Bristol Siddeley's Olympus 22R, a development of the power plant fitted to the Vulcan bomber, was selected over a Rolls-Royce alternative in part because Bristol Siddeley needed the work to remain viable. The 22R had to be uprated to produce 30,610 pounds of thrust with reheat, and its development consumed a disproportionate share of the programme's budget. A test rig engine exploded at Patchway in July 1963, killing no one but damaging the test facility and setting the programme back by 6 months. The Ministry of Aviation was informed but chose not to brief the Cabinet in detail. By late 1963, the project's projected total cost had risen from an initial £90 million to £175 million and was still climbing. Sir Solly Zuckerman, having transferred from the MOD to become Chief Scientific Advisor to the Cabinet in 1964, wrote memoranda arguing that the F-111 could be purchased from the United States for a fraction of the sum. His view carried weight with Harold Wilson, who took office in October 1964 with a Treasury Chief Secretary, Diane Jay, briefing him that the aircraft was unaffordable. The RAF began to sense the direction of the wind. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Elworthy, Chief of the Air Staff from 1963, requested a meeting at number 10. Elworthy's meeting with Wilson took place at Downing Street on January 21, 1965. The Chief of the Air Staff brought with him a folder of performance data from the recent flight trials, and a paper arguing that the American alternative was neither cheaper nor more capable when total lifetime costs were calculated honestly. Wilson listened. He was not persuaded. The Prime Minister had been a Board of Trade economist during the war and treated cost projections as instruments of political struggle rather than technical fact. He believed, on advice from Zuckerman and from his Cabinet Secretary Sir Burke Trend, that the TSR-2 would eventually cost the country more than the whole of the Polaris submarine program, then being negotiated with Washington under the Nassau Agreement of December 1962. Denis Healey occupied the harder position. As Defence Secretary, he had ordered a comprehensive review of British commitments east of Suez, and he calculated that Britain could not simultaneously maintain a strategic nuclear deterrent, a conventional presence in Singapore and Aden, a contribution to NATO's Northern Army Group, and an indigenous strike aircraft program. Something had to be surrendered. Healey chose the aircraft. In his memoirs written a quarter of a century later, he still defended the decision as economically correct while acknowledging the human cost at Weybridge and Wharton. The workforce at BAC's Preston division alone stood at some 20,000, of whom several thousand were directly employed on TSR-2 work. The Treasury demand for physical destruction when it came in May 1965 was extraordinary in its thoroughness. Sir William Armstrong, Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, insisted that the jigs and tooling be broken up on the grounds that any residual capability might tempt a successor government to reopen the programme and thereby waste further public funds. Whitehall officials also worried about industrial embarrassment. If the airframes survived intact, they could be photographed for years afterwards, as reminders of a cancelled national ambition. The three prototypes then in various stages of completion at Weybridge, XR219, XR220 and XR222, were ordered dismantled. XR221 was to be delivered to the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down for structural testing to destruction, effectively the same fate by a different route. At Weybridge, the destruction began in late July. Photographs taken by BAC apprentices, some of which surfaced in aviation magazines decades later, show fuselage sections being cut through the wing roots with handheld cutters. Sir George Edwards forbade formal ceremonies. He wrote privately to his wife that he could not bring himself to visit the shop floor while the work was proceeding. Roland Beaumont, who had flown XR219 through the sound barrier only months earlier, took the trouble to drive to Boscombe Down to see the aircraft one last time, and later described the scene in a manner that was atypically brief. He said only that it was the worst afternoon of his life. 2 airframes were spared for reasons that had more to do with bureaucratic inertia than sentiment. XR220 had been damaged in transit before its first flight and was regarded as unairworthy. It was eventually transferred to the RAF Museum at Cosford. XR222, incomplete, was passed to the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. Everything else, including a substantial quantity of forward fuselage tooling stored at Samlesbury, went to the scrapyard at Cocklebarrow. The demolition was completed by the end of 1965. The F111 order was subsequently cancelled too in January 1968 on grounds of cost. The intelligence dimension of the TSR-2 story has been reconstructed only partially, and much of it remains contested. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired throughout the critical period by Sir Bernard Burroughs, had been assessing Soviet air defense developments continuously since the mid-1950s. Its papers, some of which were released by the National Archives at Kew during the 1990s, indicate that by 1963, the JIC believed Warsaw Pact integrated air defenses were becoming dense enough to threaten any manned aircraft operating above 2,000 feet within 20 miles of the inner German border. This assessment was one of the strongest arguments for a low-level strike aircraft rather than an F111-style medium-level penetrator, though the F111 also had low-level capability. GCHQ contributed signals intelligence on Soviet radar deployments through liaison with the American National Security Agency under the UK-USA arrangement. Cheltenham's assessments identified the SA-2 sites around Berlin and along the Elbe, and later the SA-3 Goa deployments that began in 1962. The RAF's own operational research at High Wycombe, under Air Vice Marshal Sir Kenneth Cross, calculated that a Canberra flying at 40,000 feet in daylight over East Germany had a survival probability of less than 30% by 1964. A TSR-2 flying at 200 feet, using terrain-following radar developed by Ferranti, was assessed at over 80%. These numbers were briefed to the Defence Council but never made public. MI6's contribution was smaller but material. Sir Dick White, Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service from 1956 to 1968, had inherited from his MI5 tenure a keen interest in Soviet technical intelligence. His officers ran agents in East Germany and Poland who reported on airfield construction and the deployment of IL-28 Beagle bombers, whose replacement, the Yak-28, was being introduced in 1962. The evidence suggested that Soviet forward-deployed strike aircraft would give the Warsaw Pact a first strike capability against RAF Germany's airfields at Gütersloh, Wildenrath, Laarbruch and Bruggen, unless Britain could hold them at risk by comparable means. Oleg Penkovsky, the GRU colonel run jointly by SIS and CIA between 1961 and 1962, had confirmed the direction of Soviet tactical air doctrine before his arrest. None of this saved the aircraft. The intelligence case for a low-level strike capability was accepted. The industrial case for producing it in Britain was not. Zuckerman argued that the same military requirement could be met by American aircraft procured off the shelf, and that Britain's limited defence budget should be concentrated on the Polaris programme, which alone constituted a truly independent deterrent. Wilson accepted this analysis. The JIC was not asked to evaluate whether procuring the F-111 would create strategic dependencies on Washington. That was treated as a political rather than an intelligence matter, and the political judgment had already been made in favour of the American purchase before the papers were fully circulated. The Polaris Agreement itself, negotiated at Nassau by Harold Macmillan and John F. Kennedy in December 1962, cast a long shadow over TSR-2. Macmillan had traded away the Skybolt air-launched ballistic missile in exchange for submarine-launched Polaris missiles, and in doing so had implicitly conceded that Britain's future strategic deterrent would be maritime rather than aerial. The V-bombers, Valiant, Vulcan, Victor, would revert to conventional and tactical nuclear roles. A new manned strike aircraft could no longer justify itself by reference to strategic deterrence. It had to earn its budget on tactical grounds alone. In the Treasury calculations of 1965, those tactical grounds proved insufficient. The workforce discovered the decision from the wireless. On the afternoon of April 6, 1965, Denis Healey rose in the Commons and announced the cancellation as part of the budget statement. And by evening the shop stewards at Weybridge, Wharton and Samlesbury were fielding questions they could not answer. Sir George Edwards had known for perhaps 48 hours. The men on the shop floor had known for less than that. Bill Jordan, later General Secretary of the AEU, was then a young engineer at Wharton, and recalled that the news arrived in the canteen at tea time, and produced not anger but a peculiar silence, broken eventually by an older man asking whether anyone knew what would happen to their pension contributions. The Amalgamated Engineering Union and the Draftsmen and Allied Technicians Association together represented most of the skilled workforce, and both moved quickly to demand meetings with the Minister of Aviation, Roy Jenkins. Jenkins, only recently appointed and personally sceptical of the cancellation, agreed to receive delegations at his department in Millbank Tower. He offered sympathy but no reversal. Redundancy notices began to circulate at BAC divisions during the summer. Approximately 5,000 jobs were lost directly from the TSR-2 program, with a similar number lost through knock-on effects on subcontractors. Bristol Siddeley's Patchway Works, which had been tooled up for full-scale Olympus 22R production, shed several hundred workers between June and October. Preston was hit hardest. The town's identity had been bound up with English Electric and its successors since the war. The Canberra had been designed there, the Lightning was built there, and TSR-2 was to be the third generation of that lineage. The Lancashire Evening Post ran a series of interviews with laid-off workers during August 1965, and its editorials treated the cancellation as a betrayal by a Labour government that had promised the white heat of technological revolution. Harold Wilson's phrase, delivered at the party conference in Scarborough in October 1963, was now thrown back at him repeatedly. The Preston constituencies, however, would not turn against Labour immediately. That came later, cumulatively, and for wider reasons. At Weybridge, the atmosphere was more subdued. Vickers had been building aircraft on the site since 1915, and the workforce contained many men who had worked on the Wellington, the Valiant and the VC-10. They were used to the cyclical nature of the industry. What shocked them was the destruction order. It was one thing to be told that no further aircraft would be built. It was another to be instructed to break up the ones already on the line. A shop steward interviewed by the BBC's Panorama in November 1965 said that his men would have preferred to see the airframes flown out to a museum than to be told to cut them up themselves. That interview, if it survives, has not been located in the BBC archive. The Panorama file on TSR-2 for that period is incomplete. The wider economic consequences were absorbed by the Concorde project, which was gathering momentum at Weybridge and Filton during the same period, and by the Anglo-French Jaguar strike trainer, whose specification was being finalised in 1965. Neither absorbed the TSR-2 workforce fully. Skilled labour was dispersed across the industry. Some emigrated to work on the American SST proposal, or with Boeing in Seattle. The Ministry of Technology, under Tony Benn from 1966, took over responsibility for aerospace policy and began the consolidations that would eventually produce British Aerospace in 1977. The industrial base that Sandys had rationalised in 1960 was rationalised again and again after that. The parliamentary aftermath ran for years. The Public Accounts Committee, chaired by Sir Harmar Nichols, opened an inquiry into TSR-2 in the autumn of 1965 and produced its report in 1966. The document, running to over 200 pages of evidence, concluded that the project had been mismanaged from the outset by both the Ministry of Aviation and the contractors, but declined to apportion blame in a manner that would have been politically usable. Sir George Edwards gave evidence over 2 full sittings and defended his company's performance in terms that committee members later described as dignified and unflinching. He accepted that costs had escalated, but attributed the escalation primarily to specification changes imposed by the air staff after contracts were signed. Denis Healey continued to argue the case for cancellation in the Commons through 1966 and 1967. When the F111 order was itself cancelled in January 1968, following the devaluation of sterling in November 1967, his position became more difficult. Britain had now paid cancellation charges on both aircraft and had no strike aircraft in prospect for the RAF beyond the Buccaneer, an aircraft that the air staff had rejected in 1958 as inadequate for the strike role and now had to accept faute de mieux. The Buccaneer had been designed by Blackburn Aircraft for the Royal Navy's low-level maritime strike mission and possessed neither the range nor the supersonic dash of the TSR-2. But it existed, it worked, and it was British. The RAF took the Buccaneer S-2 into service from October 1969, initially with 12 Squadron at Honington. Air Chief Marshal Sir Andrew Humphrey, later Chief of the Air Staff, remarked privately that the aircraft was better than its critics had predicted and worse than its supporters claimed. It served creditably in RAF Germany and later in the Gulf War of 1991, dropping laser-guided bombs on Iraqi airfields as part of Operation Granby. Its terminal service life extended into 1994, by which time the youngest airframes were over 20 years old. The strike role for which TSR-2 had been specified was eventually filled by the Panavia Tornado GR-1, a collaborative program initiated in 1968 involving Britain, West Germany, and Italy. The Tornado's development history reads in some respects as a vindication of the Zuckerman argument. It was designed collaboratively, cost was shared across 3 national budgets, and it entered RAF service in 1980 as an aircraft substantially more capable than TSR-2 would have been at first-of-class delivery. It was also, from a British industrial perspective, a compromise. The airframe was built at Wharton, but major components came from Munich and Turin, and the sovereignty over specification, upgrade and export was correspondingly diluted. When British Aerospace pursued export sales to Saudi Arabia, through the Al Yamama agreements of 1985 and 1988, The Ministry of Defense had to negotiate its way through Bonn and Rome, as well as Riyadh. Roland Beaumont retired from British Aircraft Corporation in 1979 and spent much of his retirement writing about the aircraft he had flown. His 1980 book on the TSR-2 program was neither a lament nor a polemic, but a technical account, and it contained one passage that historians have quoted repeatedly since. Beaumont wrote that on his final flight in XR219, he had achieved Mach 1.12 at low level, with reheat engaged, and had noted in his post-flight report that the aircraft was, in his professional judgment, ready to begin its service acceptance trials. That report survives at the RAF Museum's archive at Hendon. It is dated March 31, 1965, 6 days before the cancellation was announced. The counterfactual arguments began almost immediately and have continued for 6 decades. Sir Solly Zuckerman published his memoir Monkeys, Men and Missiles in 1988, 3 years before his death, and defended the cancellation on the grounds that TSR-2 had been an unaffordable gold-plated solution to a requirement that could have been met more cheaply by any of several alternatives. He was answered in a series of articles and letters to the Times through the late 1980s by former BAC engineers and by Sir Sidney Cam's biographer, who argued that Zuckerman had never understood the operational reasoning behind the low-level supersonic requirement. The dispute grew personal. It also grew in the end unresolvable because the aircraft that would have permitted a fair comparison had been destroyed. Peter Hennessy's work on the post-war British state, particularly the Secret State published in 2002, situates the cancellation within the broader pattern of Whitehall's retreat from imperial defence commitments during the 1960s. Hennessy argues that the TSR-2 decision cannot be understood in isolation from Healey's 1966 Defence Review, which announced the withdrawal from east of Suez, or from the Nassau Agreement of 1962, which had already redefined the British nuclear posture. The aircraft was not, in this reading, killed by cost overruns alone. It was killed by a strategic reorientation that no longer required an independent British capability for the delivery of tactical nuclear weapons from continental European bases. Sir Michael Howard, writing later, offered a different judgment. Howard, whose The Continental Commitment had traced Britain's reluctant entanglements with European defence over 2 centuries, viewed the TSR-2 cancellation as part of a wider pattern in which British governments consistently underestimated the industrial consequences of defence procurement decisions. The industrial base, once lost, could not easily be reconstituted. The design teams that had produced the TSR-2 dispersed within 18 months of the cancellation. Some went to Concorde, some to the Anglo-French Jaguar, some emigrated. When the Tornado program required British design leadership at Wharton in the early 1970s, the necessary skills had to be partly rebuilt from scratch. Denis Healey never publicly regretted the cancellation, but did, in his 1989 autobiography, The Time of My Life, concede that the decision to destroy the tooling had been a mistake. He wrote that Sir William Armstrong's insistence on physical demolition had reflected Treasury paranoia rather than sound policy, and that the airframes and jigs could reasonably have been mothballed against future contingency. Whether Healey would have made this concession while still in office is a separate question. The Wilson government of 1964 to 70 conducted itself throughout its life under intense fiscal pressure, and treated demonstrations of parsimony as politically necessary rather than optional. Mothballing would have been read as weakness. The final judgment on the TSR-2 depends on which counterfactual one prefers. If the aircraft would have entered RAF service in 1969 at the projected unit cost, it would have provided a formidable capability that only the American F-111 could match. If it would have entered service in 1972 at double the projected cost, as Zuckerman believed, it would have consumed budget necessary for other programs, and would have delivered its capability too late to affect the strategic balance. Neither counterfactual can be verified. What can be verified is that the physical destruction of the airframes and jigs foreclosed any possibility of revisiting the decision. That was, from the Treasury's point of view, the entire objective of the demolition order. The archives at Kew hold the paper trail. Hold. AVIA 65 and DEFE 13 series contain the ministerial correspondence, the cabinet papers and the technical assessments that shaped the decision, and successive releases through the 1990s and 2000s have permitted historians to reconstruct the decision-making process in considerable detail. Sir Denis Healey's papers, deposited at the London School of Economics, contain his private notes on the cabinet meeting of April 1, 1965, and his subsequent correspondence with Wilson and with Roy Jenkins. Sir George Edwards' papers held at the Brooklands Museum contain the BAC internal memoranda on the destruction order and photographs of the airframes being cut apart at Weybridge during the summer of 1965. The two surviving airframes rest in museum silence. XR-2, 2O at the Royal Air Force Museum's Cosford site sits in the Cold War Hall alongside a Valiant, a Vulcan and a Victor, the trio it was never called upon to succeed. XR-222 at Duxford, transferred there from Cranfield in 1978, sits in a hangar with a Concorde prototype and a Comet airliner, three cancelled or curtailed British aviation ambitions in close proximity. Visitors can walk beneath both airframes, neither has ever flown. XR-220 was damaged in a transport accident on September 14, 1964, while being moved by lorry from Weybridge to Boscombe Down, and never had its first flight. XR-222 was structurally complete but never fitted with engines. The forward fuselage of XR-219, the only airframe that flew, was preserved by mistake. A section of the nose was set aside at Boscombe Down for structural fatigue testing in a rig that was never completed, and when the rig was dismantled in 1967, the fuselage section was quietly moved to storage rather than scrapped. It resurfaced in the 1980s and was eventually restored by volunteers at the RAF Museum at Cosford, where it now sits beside XR-220 as an unintended survivor of the demolition order. Roland Beaumont visited the display in 1996, 3 years before his death, and reportedly touched the nose without speaking. The industrial consequences reached beyond aerospace. The rationalisation that produced British aerospace in 1977 concentrated British defence aviation capability into a single firm, which was then privatised in 1981 under the Thatcher government's first-term programme. The workforce at Wharton, sustained through the intervening years by the Jaguar, the Tornado and eventually the Eurofighter Typhoon, remained substantially in place, though its numbers halved between 1965 and 1990 and continued to fall afterwards. Weybridge, where TSR-2 was to have been assembled, closed as an aircraft factory in 1989. The site is now a shopping centre and a museum. The runway on which XR-219 was designed to be flight tested has been built over. The larger question of whether Britain could have sustained an independent supersonic strike aircraft programme through the 1970s and 1980s remains in the professional literature disputed. Lawrence Freedman's Britain and the Falklands War touches on it obliquely. Sir Michael Quinlan's papers on nuclear strategy touch on it not at all. What the archives do establish is that on April 6, 1965, a specific instruction was signed by Denis Healey, that within weeks welders at Weybridge and Wharton were breaking apart the aircraft they had built, and that the physical evidence of what British industry had for a moment achieved was systematically reduced to scrap on the direct order of the British Treasury. The tooling has never been reconstructed. It cannot be.